So when you had 4 years of a madman in control of the United States, that madman had his finger on the nuclear button, and he could launch weapons within about 7 minutes of a decision to do so. That's how this system goes, and that's one of the reasons why nuclear weapons remain one of the 3 great existential threats we face.
Football season is here. I'm continuing to be on a football field, and welcome to a new episode, summer special episode of Independent Americans. I'm your host, Paul Rieckhoff. I have been thankful enough to spend the last couple of days on a football field, which is a reminder of the potential of the youth in this country, a reminder of what it's like to give back to our communities, and a reminder that there is hope ahead. Whether you're a Browns fan, a Bengals fan, a Rutgers fan, a Lions fan, this is a time of year when folks are hopeful. High school teams, youth teams all around this country are coming together and hopeful. I want to continue to spread that hope. I'm going to continue to bring you replay episodes. I'm going to bring you one of those in a second. But first, a couple of issues at the top of the headlines. Number one, Trump has now fully waged war against Canada economically. He has always been aggressive and unchained in his wars, and now that includes our economic warfare with Canada. And Canada is not having it. They are pushing back. They are punching back. They are calling his bluff. And it's weird because I almost feel like I'm rooting for Canada. I'm rooting for them versus Trump. I'm not rooting for them versus America, but they have finally called out his bluff. They are pushing him on his most basic promises to lower prices and make life better for Americans. And he hasn't done it, and he's hurting Canadians. And here we are, another war, as if Iran and Venezuela and potentially Cuba aren't enough. We are actually, 2026, we are actually in an economic war with, of all people, Canada. That's where we are, folks, as football season starts. Thankfully, we're not playing them in Canadian football. Another issue I got to touch on, the passing of Dolly Parton. Maybe almost more American than football, the great, legendary, iconic, inspiring Dolly Parton has passed. I've said a number of times America would be an amazing place if Dolly Parton was president. She can't be president, but she can forever be an inspiration, a role model, a positive light, and a representation to America and the world about what's possible, and to the world about what Americans can do and be like. Dolly Parton is bigger than music. She's bigger than America. And her passing is a tremendous loss at 80 years old. Of course, my condolences go to her and her families. But I think it's an important time to celebrate all that she was, all that she did, all that she gave back, building libraries and fighting for good causes and just speaking truth to power and being honest and real about herself, about our world, and about what's ahead. Dolly Parton was part of that hope, part of that change, part of that positivity, the best of what America is all about. And that's what this show has always been about, elevating leaders, iconic, inspiring, important leaders that are meeting the moment. And I will continue to do this in this special replay episode, another replay episode. I hope you enjoyed Rosie Perez yesterday. If you haven't heard Jesse Ventura last week, please go back and check that out, and check out all our exclusive and extensive conversations with independent candidates and independent veterans who are stepping up to meet this moment in the spirit of America, in the spirit of fighting, in the spirit of Dolly Parton. So I'm going to get back to the boys at football practice. It's a beautiful evening here in New York. It's amazing football weather. It's about 75 degrees. The sun's going down. The lights are coming on. And the pads are here. They got the pads on. It's time for football. But it's also a time for reflection, for celebration, for community, and for staying vigilant. So here it is, another one of my favorite episodes from the archives, over 600 and counting. If you haven't been to independentamericans.us, check it out. If you haven't been to our YouTube page, do me a solid and just hit subscribe. Hit subscribe on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, wherever you listen or watch, and spread the word. Welcome people into this community as we go into an amazing fall and we finish summer strong. Until next time, enjoy football. God bless Dolly Parton. Canada, hang in there. We're trying to change it. And enjoy your football. Enjoy this episode and stay vigilant.
vigilant.
Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world. Thanksgiving's coming up, and there is a lot to be thankful for. And there is a lot on the out of the news that we should still be tracking on, because maybe one of the major things we should be thankful for is that there's not a nuclear war happening. And it is a threat that remains. It is a threat that is front and center. It is a threat that we are diving into in the new series we're doing with Sean Ephraim and Anthony LePay and Jeffrey Wright at Vice TV, called While the Rest of Us Die. And I really wanted to bring to our audience and to our community, really, I think, the best, most dynamic voice on the issue. So before we get to Thanksgiving and reflect and are grateful, we're going to have a serious conversation about maybe the most serious issue of all, with a man who knows it inside and out, a man I met many years ago. The great and powerful Joe Cirincione joins us on Independent Americans. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, I did say your name correctly that time. Did I
Yeah,
get it?
Cirincione, you nailed it.
It's a tough one. It's a tough one, but it's tougher than Rieckhoff, which sounds easy but reads tough.
Well, even for Italian Americans, it's a long, complicated name.
Well, my grandmother was Italian. Her name was Galella, and
There
my
you go.
mother's mother is Italian, so they will give me maybe some points at Thanksgiving for getting the name right.
Well, in Italiano, it's Giuseppe Cirincione, but who could say that?
Giuseppe Cirincione. I'll try. I wish, Italy is one of the places I miss most since the pandemic hit. We haven't been back. Family
Yeah.
usually goes often, so maybe in the future, we can have a drink in Italy and celebrate a
Yes.
more peaceful world.
A nice
Um,
Negroni cocktail. Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to get into a lot. I think that this news Vice series kind of reminded me and will remind everybody how important the issues that you live every day are for our country and for the world. So I want to talk, really break down, what I think is the most urgent threat to the world, and how it's a constant threat. It's not just one from the Reagan era or from election campaigns. It's something that's all around us. And I think the new series breaks that down. You've been a great thought leader for as long as I've known you, but I want to start by asking you the same question I ask everybody. It's been a wild year and a half in the world and in America. Joe, where are you and how are you?
I'm in Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is right outside Washington, D.C. I've been here for 40 years. I came to D.C. as a graduate student at Georgetown. I never left. I didn't intend to stay, but one thing led to another, and I've been in government or in think tanks or for the last 12 years as a philanthropist, the head of Plowshares Fund, until I stepped down last year. So I've had a great career, and most of that time has been spent on nuclear policy, nuclear weapons policy. And despite that, I'm doing fine. Despite that, I still have an optimistic, attitude and a nice little pep in my step.
You always bring great energy. I think that's important in not scaring the shit out of people every time that they have to talk to you and dive into these issues, right? And I think
Yes,
that's part of your skill is you've been able to really help communicate this to people who are not technicians, who are not experts, who are average Americans who care about their country and their families and the future. So, you know, the pandemic has kind of occupied so much oxygen. And
mhm.
now we've got an infrastructure bill going through, and I want to ask you maybe if you can touch on whether there's anything in there that can address or protect the interest and issues that you care about. But can you start at the top?
Sure.
I think it's the biggest threat facing the world, and it was the threat I used to always remind people about when Trump did crazy shit. I
Yeah.
said, look, remember, he has access to nukes. You think it can't
Yeah.
get worse. It can get much worse. And I think that only at the end, in the final days of the Trump era, did folks really realize how possible or immediate that threat could be. So
Yeah.
maybe can you frame it up for us? The
Sure.
threat of do we still call it nuclear holocaust?
Yes.
The frame it up for us and break it down. What is the threat? What is the scope? What is the urgency in your view, please?
Well, it's understandable that people wouldn't focus on this, wouldn't be thinking about this. I mean, the Cold War's been over for 30 years, and most people thought, well, that's it. We're getting rid of our nuclear weapons. The problem has gone away. Well, the Cold War is over, but the weapons remain. The US and Russia have about 6,000 nuclear weapons each. That's over 90% of the global total. So when you're talking about nuclear weapons, you're really talking about the United States and Russia. And many of these weapons remain on hair trigger alert, ready to launch at a moment's notice. And in the United States, they're under the control of one person, the president. The president can launch nuclear weapons whenever he wants, and it's always been a he so far, whenever he wants, for whatever reason he wants. He doesn't need the approval of the vice president or the secretary of defense, certainly not Congress. There's no time for a Supreme Court brief on this. So when you had 4 years of a madman in control of the United States, that madman had his finger on the nuclear button, and he could launch weapons within about 7 minutes of a decision to do so. That's how the system goes. And that's one of the reasons why nuclear weapons remain one of the three great existential threats we face. But all the challenges we have in our lives, there are only three that threaten destruction on a planetary scale. Climate change can destroy human civilization over the decades. Pandemics, as we're now seeing, can wreak havoc over years. Nuclear weapons can destroy everything humanity has produced over the millennia in an afternoon. It's real, they're still here, and we've got to do something about it.
I think that's a great framework. So I want to go around the scope, but we know that the U.S. and Russia have 90% of the nukes in the world. Can you tell us who has the rest?
Sure.
And who are other players on this and on this landscape in 2021?
There's a total of 7 countries with nuclear weapons, which, by the way, is a great victory for nuclear arms control and disarmament. There used to be 25 countries that had programs and were interested, but because of government policy, because of liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats working together, we created an international system of controls that have shrunk the arsenals and that have shrunk the number of countries trying to get these weapons. So what we're left with is the US and Russia still with Cold War arsenals on Cold War use doctrines. After that, you get France, interestingly enough, which has about 350 weapons. China, about the same number as France, but building up. The United Kingdom, which comes in just under 200 weapons. India and Pakistan, very dangerous situation. Countries that have fought 4 wars since they got independence, now with nuclear arms, about 150 each. And then you have North Korea and Israel. Israel never acknowledged its nuclear weapons. They have about 80. North Korea has enough material for around 40 to 60 and is building up. And that's it. Only 7 countries. The only other country you're truly worried about is Iran, which does not have nuclear weapons, but is slowly but steadily building the capability to make them. And so that's your major proliferation threat in the world today.
That's a great overview. And I'm Israel's always the question mark, right? Like they don't publicly admit it, but everyone knows they have it. Is that kind of how it works right now?
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
They used material we gave them in the 60s under the Atoms for Peace program for the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And they broke their agreements and secretly constructed nuclear weapons. And they had their first bomb around 1968, right at the end of the 1968 war. And they've had them ever since. They have a triad, actually. They can drop them by plane. They can drop them by missile. And they also have nuclear-armed submarines that fire nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. So they are the only nuclear power in the Middle East.
I was going to ask you about delivery, and you named 3 methods. Are there other methods? And I'm thinking a dirty bomb or a smuggled detonation of some kind. Is that a real threat? And I want to get to space. But
Sure.
Is this the time? What are the current 2021 methods to deliver that kind of an attack?
Sure. A dirty bomb is what they call a radiological device. That is, it's a conventional explosive, say dynamite, that's laced with radioactive material, say cesium or americium. And it spreads nuclear dust, basically, over dozens of square blocks. So it's a killer, but it's a slow killer. It causes cancer. It's not a nuclear explosion. Any terrorist can create this. In fact, most experts are surprised we haven't seen this yet. But that's different from a nuclear explosive device, much more complicated, much more difficult to make. And we're fortunate that Al-Qaeda or ISIS hasn't constructed this. It takes a large, wealthy, sophisticated terrorist organization to do this. And we're worried about a nuclear 9/11 for the last 10, 20 years, hasn't happened. And again, because countries did something about it, securing the materials, preventing the terrorists from getting it. Most of the nuclear threats we're worried about, though, are in the military, and you can deliver them traditionally by missile, by bomber, by sub. But there's also cruise missiles, so you can put cruise missiles on bomber, and now you have kind of a combination platform. And we used to have, the United States and Russia did, many what we call tactical nuclear weapons, battlefield use. And in the 50s and 60s, we saw nuclear and conventional as integrated, that we thought that nuclear would be used in a conflict between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, for example. So we had nuclear artillery brigades. Colin Powell used to be in charge of one in West Germany. He writes in his memoirs, but as soon as he was told what he was supposed to do, he thought that was completely nuts. And he was right. Nuclear artillery, nuclear landmines, nuclear depth charges, short-range rockets, long-range rockets. We nuked everything in the 50s and 60s, and we've come back from all that. There were very few of that type of short-range delivery system left, except for India and Pakistan, which do imagine fighting a close-in war. And so they do have artillery units with nuclear devices. They have short-range rockets, and we think they have what they call man-portable or nuclear landmines that they're developing.
I think the kind of uptown and downtown versions of nukes are really important for folks to understand the framework of all this. This episode of Independent Americans is sponsored by Kalshi. We make predictions every single day. We talk about it on this show: politics, pop culture, the economy, the biggest stories making headlines all across America and around the world. Kalshi, America's #1 prediction market platform, lets you trade those predictions in a live market. If you haven't checked it out, now is the time, especially around politics and the elections. Will Trump buy at least part of Greenland? If you think he'll do that before 2027 and you wager $100, it'll pay out $2,019.24. If you think it's going to be before January 20th, 2029, it's 17%. You can also pick whether or not you think the Republicans or the Democrats are going to win Congress. You can pick who you think the Democratic nominee will be, who the Republican nominee. It would be great to see if there's an independent nominee. There's a lot that you can wager on, but on Kalshi, you're trading against peers in a live market, meaning there's no house. And as the probability changes, you can buy in and out of your position. It's fun. And if you listen to this show, you can stay ahead of the curve. So download the Kalshi app and use the code INDEPENDENT and get up to $500 in bonus credits when you trade 25, which is pretty good. Kalshi, 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 trade on anything. 18 and older, restrictions and eligibility requirements apply. Event contract trading involves risk and may not be suitable for all investors. Kalshi products are not available in all jurisdictions. Prices, values, and available markets may differ from those mentioned. For more information, see kalshi.com/regulatory. Independent Americans, now is the time. Check out Kalshi. We've I think those of us who live and occupy the national security space, whenever you see, an authoritarian like Trump, or you see someone unstable like Kim Jong-un, or you see disruption in Pakistan and the constant tension between India and Pakistan, there's always a question. It seems to be, primarily around India and Pakistan, of how secure are they? Can you lay that out for us? I mean, you've given us the framework of
Sure.
Trump having access and others. 90% are U.S. and Russia. But how secure are the nukes in a place like Pakistan right now?
Well, they're actually quite secure for two reasons. One, these are the crown jewels of the Pakistan military and the Indian nuclear scientific establishment. So they are tightly guarded. They are also relatively few in number, and they store them in a very good way. They store them unassembled. So unlike the United States and Russia, for example, where our nuclear warheads are already on the missiles, already ready to go, you just got to program them, push a button, and they launch. In India and Pakistan, these would have to be assembled in order to be used. So that's a good thing. The problem is not with the security of the weapons, it's with the security of the government. So Pakistan has an unstable government, a deteriorating economy, strong fundamentalist forces in the military, in the intelligence establishment, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS operating within the national territory of Pakistan. And of course, this simmering conflict with its nuclear armed neighbor. So a whole lot of things can go wrong. Let me give you the nightmare scenario. The nightmare scenario is we see a repeat of the 2008 Mumbai attack when Pakistan-based terrorists killed 150, 160 people at a Mumbai hotels in order to provoke a war. That's what they wanted to do. And one of the reasons they may have wanted to do that is to flush out the nuclear weapons. Because in a conflict, you got to then assemble the weapons and move them to the battlefield, and that's when they become vulnerable. So the nightmare scenario is you see a replay of Mumbai, Pakistan mobilizes, and en route to the battlefield, the train, the truck convoy is hijacked, the nuclear weapons are stolen, and now you have a terrorist group with nuclear weapons, and there's almost nothing you can do about it at that point. Very difficult to stop somebody like that from detonating a bomb at the place of their choosing. Just read any Tom Clancy novel.
Joe, it's a good thing you're such a nice guy and you're so charismatic, because otherwise you'd probably be the last person people want to sit next to at Thanksgiving. I mean,
I'm a scintillating dinner companion.
You are. You absolutely are. But if folks, we always say stay vigilant, and this is an issue that requires vigilance, even when it's uncomfortable.
Let me just give you the worst part about this.
Please.
So in that India-Pakistan scenario, you could quickly go from conventional conflict to nuclear. Pakistan is outgunned by the Indian army, and they've said, just like we said about the Warsaw Pact, if India invades Pakistan, they will use nukes to stop them. India said, if you do that, we're going to nuke you back. And as some have said, Indian generals will have a final solution to the Pakistan problem. So this is pretty grim, cold-blooded talk. And you would not only have a nuclear war in South Asia, but even though we wouldn't feel it here in North America or Europe or South America, the fires that these weapons would set off, scientists now calculate, would put enough smoke and particulate into the atmosphere that it would shroud the Earth in a cloud for 2 to 3 years, dropping global temperatures about 2 or 3 degrees. And before you think, a solution to global warming, that would kill about 40% of the food crops in the world, triggering a famine that we estimate would kill between 1 billion and 2 billion people. And that is a civilization-ending event. So even a war that we don't feel in a half the world away could bring about the end of human civilization. That is a constant and big worry, and we're not doing anything about it.
I'm glad you took us through that, and I think the Vice series does a pretty good job of framing up different components of this, and one that I was glad. I'm a consulting producer on the show. We've been talking about these issues. I'm glad we had time and space to dig into is the scope of testing that the U.S. has done on U.S. soil, right? We tell the story by starting in the Bikini Islands, and then we go to Nevada outside of Vegas. And was the number a couple of hundred? Give us a sense of how many detonations or explosions, however you frame it, have been done on U.S. soil, in the last, 100 years or however long it's been.
We stopped testing. We started testing in 1945 and we stopped in 1992, and we conducted over 1,000 tests, more than every other nation combined, most of those on continental United States soil. That is a lot of tests. That's a lot of radioactivity. We stopped testing in the atmosphere in the mid-'60s. John F. Kennedy negotiated what they call the Limited Test Ban Treaty, a major accomplishment. But before then, we were popping them off, a couple of hundred a year were going off in those years. And that has spewed radiation all through America and around the world, resulting in rising cancer rates. The way this works is the radiation not like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it doesn't kill you right away. It increases your risk of cancer, which shows up 10 years later, 20 years later. And we cared so little about this that we never tracked it. So there are no accurate numbers, which is why I'm so glad the Vice TV show focused on these nuclear victims. As I say in the show, Jeffrey Wright says in the show, the only people nuclear weapons have killed since we used them in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were Americans. And we
Right.
think that's about 100 to maybe 200,000 people, miners, people near the test site, people downwind from the test site, Marshallese Islanders, all victims of nuclear weapons.
And is it a few 100,000 soldiers? We show this in While the Rest of Us Die as well. These images of soldiers that volunteered or recruited, and they would experience the blast. They stand up and they walk toward the blast. And now we know, it was part of my work at IAVA, they were called the atomic veterans, right? Tens
Yeah,
of thousands, maybe
yeah.
hundreds of thousands that were exposed and didn't receive recognition from the government. It's the same old story we've seen with Agent Orange and burn pits and so many others, where these veterans are sick and dying, and their families, and they have to advocate for themselves, many of whom are already dead. But can you give us a little bit of insight into that component as
No,
well?
I'm including them in my totals. We don't have a separate breakout for them for the same reason. If it's not a combat casualty, it's just not tracked. There was no compensation for that. Veterans have been fighting for decades to get this compensation. And when they do get it, it tends to be just a fraction of what their cancer therapies cost.
Yeah, what was I think it was like 50,000 or
About
$100,000.
$50,000 per settlement. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So they get $50,000 to try to deal with fatal cancer, basically,
Yeah.
and
Leukemia.
and they had to fight and scrape to get it, and there's no good data. So
And the fight
please.
continues. I mean, even this year, there's bills in the Congress to try to compensate the Marshallese Islanders. These were beautiful people, and the Vice TV show does a great job of showing them, who were promised that they would be lifted off their islands for a little while and then brought back. Instead, we vaporized their islands. We poisoned their fishing grounds. They lost their livelihoods. They lost their homes. Never been compensated.
And Native American indigenous people who were displaced, whose lands were annihilated, whose people were made sick. That's a really important part of the through line. And I think maybe one of the most powerful parts of this episode of While the Rest of Us Die is, Anthony and the team go to Nevada and talk to people who lived through it, right? The
Yes.
woman describes being a child sitting on her couch and seeing her living room light up to the point where she couldn't see, right? They describe soldiers looking at their hand, with their eyes closed, being able to see the skeleton in their hand. I mean, really
Yeah.
vivid imagery about
Yes.
how
Yes.
terrible we treated our own, right?
Right. And those are what they call the downwinders, the people who are downwind from the blast. But there's also the Navajo miners who mine the uranium. Again, you get cancer from doing that. Again, never compensated.
So, Joe, I want to bring it back to now. Joe Biden is in his first year here. Nobody talks about nukes. It didn't come up really in the debates. I mean, I feel a kinship with you, and I'm watching for the word veteran every time, and you're probably
Yeah.
watching in debates for the word nukes, right? But Joe Biden's a guy who's been around a long time, who was probably there for is it the Cohen-Nunn dialogues they used to have for a long time, or
That's
right?
right.
About nuke proliferation, and I remember going to some of those events with Les Gelb, who was a mentor of mine that I think I know you knew from your time at
Yes.
CFR. But where is Biden on this? Like, frame it up for us. I know
Oh,
a lot of your work has been left of center, but I think this is an independent American issue, right? This
yeah,
should be
yeah. This
bipartisan. This should be one of those issues like infrastructure, like the pandemic, I hope, like national security, that should be a bipartisan, truly independent issue.
well,
But give us a sense, if you would, please, of where Biden is on this.
if you ask most Americans how many nuclear weapons do we need, you'd get an answer somewhere between 0 and a few hundred. And we have 6,000, 5,850. So why? Well, this is the question presidents often ask when they come into office and they're first briefed and they're first showed how to use the nuclear football. They go, well, why do we have so many? And the answer to that question quickly moves away from the effects of these weapons to abstract theories of deterrence and controlling the escalatory ladder and targeting and all this. And it's basically, it's a lot of gobbledygook. And Joe Biden's a president who's been through all this. Remember, he was elected in 72. I knew him when he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He gets this. So he sat in on hearings on arms control treaties, et cetera, et cetera. If Biden was allowed to be Biden, he would favor sharp reductions in the U.S. arsenal, unilateral. We could go down A Joint Chiefs of Staff study in 2013 said we could cut the arsenal by 1/3 and still fulfill all military missions because their weapons have gotten so much more accurate. And and he would reduce the types of nuclear weapons we have. While Trump was in, he started turning back to nuclear war fighting. So emphasis on lower yields, shorter ranges, things we could use against China, for example. He would, I think, cut those, and he would also start a more ambitious strategic dialogue, both with Russia, the current threat, and China, the rising threat. And he would push forward on his arrangements, his negotiations with Iran to stop that country from getting nuclear capabilities. I think he would do all this, and he would change U.S. policy so we don't have our weapons on hair trigger alert, so that we would never be the first to use nuclear weapons. The trouble is, and this is where the show gets so good at this, is that you run right into established bureaucracies and corporate interest. The biggest problem we have with getting a rational nuclear policy is that some people get very rich making nuclear weapons. And this is just a product to them, like tobacco or sugar or cereal, and they market it and they sell it as necessary and essential and worth whatever it costs. So as a result, these contractors have infiltrated, and this is really true, infiltrated the Pentagon. There's a constant revolving door between top policy officials and contractor jobs. They've infiltrated the Congress, massive campaign contributions to the committee members who control their budgets, big ads in all the Washington papers. If you get the Washington Post, you can't hardly open the paper without a defense contractor ads. And then they realized that they had to eliminate the disagreements that they were getting from the think tanks, from the independent experts. So like the fossil fuel companies, they started giving grants to institutes to produce pro-nuclear studies or to mute the criticism of institutes, for example, the one where I work, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, or Brookings, or basically any big institute in Washington. So as a result, that's one of the reasons there's so little debate on this. And it's one of the reasons Joe Biden's going to have such a tough time trying to implement his policy. He's going to have to buck the Pentagon bureaucracy on this, just the way he had to buck it in order to get the troops finally out of Afghanistan. It's going to be a tough fight. And frankly, I'm not very optimistic about him winning it.
I knew there was a but, and that's the most important component here. I mean, the military industrial complex extends into this realm. I've argued there's a veterans industrial complex now with the VA budget over $300 billion, and climbing on an average of 10% annually. Now there are pigs at the trough there too.
Right. So when you have a debate about, profit versus veteran health, who wins?
Right. What we've got a $1 trillion infrastructure budget going through. Is there anything in this? We think about protecting roads and fixing infrastructure. Is there any kind of safety mechanism or any kind of component of this that's connected to the world of nukes? Because in the While the Rest of Us Die, we talk about when a plane has a malfunction and two nukes fall from the sky in North Carolina, right? And they don't detonate, but we talk about this more immediate transportation threat. Is there any budgetary allocation that's related to this, or is there any connection to this in any way, Joe?
Not in the infrastructure bill. There is money for defense, but it's more related to sort of port improvements. It's kind of just, defense pork that was stuffed into the bill. But remember, we have an almost $1 trillion bill that's also moving through Congress. This is the military spending bill, the National Defense Authorization Act. It's going to be debated in the Senate this week as this program airs. And that's $778 billion. And in there's about $50 billion for nukes, plus $20 billion for missile defense programs. So about $70 billion devoted to this. And some of that is absolutely necessary. It's not all waste. As long as we have nuclear weapons, you want them to be safe, secure, and reliable. But that doesn't mean you have to build a brand new fleet of bombers, a brand new fleet of submarines, a brand new fleet of ICBMs, new types of weapons, et cetera. If you concentrated that on just making improvements to make sure they're safe and that they go off when you want them to go off and they don't go off when you don't want them to go off, we'd be a lot better off.
Yeah, I mean, the show digs into, technology malfunctions and other things that have triggered scares. And, I personally don't want, our nukes running on, Windows 98 or whatever could be in place internally. And to put it in that perspective is powerful, Joe, because they've got $70 billion this time for nukes, and they're only giving $50,000 to atomic vets. And even, the real-time conversations around burn pit exposures and toxin exposures in the Middle East, there's a concern that they don't have the money to pay for it. It could get too much. And I think it's a real revelation about where our priorities are misaligned. And that's part of what this series, I think, has done in every episode.
That's exactly right. So when you talk about health benefits for veterans or health benefits in general or pre-K programs, all of a sudden politicians start talking about, can we afford it? What's the inflationary impact here? They never raise those concerns on military programs. They never worry about how we're going to pay for it. It's just a given that we have to spend this money. We now have the largest military budget we've had in American history right now. Remember, we just ended the Afghan war. The Cold War ended 30 years ago. We're still spending more than we spent during the Vietnam War, during the Korean War, during the Reagan buildup. It's an astronomical figure, completely unjustified by our strategic needs.
Joe, in this show, we always want to talk about what's next. Strategy is often about what's next and what else. I've brought attention to the Arctic. Space is now in play. We've got a space force. The space station had to evacuate this week because
Yes.
there was shrapnel basically flying around space and could have. What's next? What is the next front in this world of nukes? And is space in play? I don't
Yeah.
know if this is sci-fi or this is reality. You're the expert. Is that a part of this in the future? I assume because of the critical nature of the communications devices and satellites, it's all an intertwined system. But what do you see
Right.
and what's next?
And this is part of what makes nuclear weapons such an urgent threat. You can't just ignore this. You can't think that everything's okay. Everything is not okay. And to compound the problems we already have that we just described, you basically have three new growing interrelated dangers. One, cyber. Cyber warfare is real. There are evil people out there wanting to do us harm, and they have these new tools to do it. And by the way, we have a cyber command trying to do the same thing to them. In fact, we invented the cyber warfare with our Stuxnet attack, that virus that infected the Iranian centrifuges, took over the machines and wrecked them. So, but other countries saw that and said, oh, we can do that too. And here we are. And so we're in a real cyber warfare. And where that intersects with nukes is nukes are not independent. They're not impenetrable. We know that the Russians have, for example, hacked into U.S. nuclear reactors. They didn't do anything yet. They just went there and let us know that they could go there. Well, you could do the same with nuclear weapons. One of my colleagues at the Nuclear Threat Initiative produced a wonderful report on this, warning that you could have a hacker, not even a state, but an independent hacker, spoof the U.S. early warning system, make us think we're being attacked when we're not. You could penetrate the weapons to make them so they won't go off when we push the button. You could penetrate the weapons here or in other countries so that they would go off even when nobody pushed a button. Okay, scary threat number one. Scary threat number two is space. The Air Force, has a slogan, space is the place. And there's always been those who wanted to fight warfare in space, the high frontier, the next frontier, and you hear that talk again. For years, this has been pushed aside. Space was the place for scientific exploration, commercial activity. You have to keep it safe. Look at what's just happened this week. The Russians did an anti-satellite test, so shot a rocket off that blew up one of their satellites and turned it. And did they vaporize it? No, it didn't disappear. It turned into 5,000 pieces of debris that are threatening the International Space Station and, by the way, the Chinese space station, and is going to be there for a decade or more. So this is a sign that people want to bring weapons into space, and that includes nuclear weapons. The Chinese just did a test that made headlines, and people talked about it as a hypervelocity missile, which is true. It traveled more than 5 times the speed of sound. That's the definition of hypervelocity, Mach 5. But all our missiles travel faster than the speed of sound. An ICBM goes 20 times the speed of sound. What made that distinct was they had a glide vehicle, something that wouldn't just go up and down like a ballistic missile, like a baseball hit into the outfield. No, it went up into orbit circled around the globe and then came down in a glide vehicle like the shuttle, think miniature space shuttle, and it could maneuver. The reason they're doing that is to make it immune to missile defenses. You can't hit that because you can't plot a trajectory. You don't know where it's going, so you can't intercept it. And they're doing that because they're reacting to U.S. missile defense systems, which we claim are going to be able to stop a Chinese nuclear attack or a North Korean nuclear attack. So you can see the race is escalating. We do something we think is going to protect us. They do something that's going to counter that defense. We're going to have to respond. So we now have a nuclear arms race in full, once again, with not just U.S. and Russia, but now involving China, other countries, and it's taking place in new domains like space. The final thing I think you really have to worry about is China, not just because of that test, but they're also beefing up their land-based missile force. They're going from about 90 long-range missiles to several hundred long-range missiles. Again, we think of that as an aggressive threat. But whenever a country does something like this, they see it as defensive, and that's why the Chinese are doing it. They think the United States wants to launch a first strike against them, knock out their relatively small arsenal of 90 missiles, and then use missile defense to mop up any that remain. So their counter is to multiply the number of missiles, make it harder for the U.S. to attack, and make sure that they can use penetration aids, maneuverability, spoofing, jamming, cyber to get through any defensive system the U.S. could construct. We've seen this movie before. It was called the Cold War. It's happening again. And the only way to stop it is not numerical competition, technological competition. You are not going to out-tech the Chinese. You are not going to spend them into oblivion like some people think we did to the Soviets. This is a country that already has 60% of the U.S. gross domestic product and will pass us by the end of this decade. This is a fierce competitor. The only way out of this is negotiations, is to have limits on their forces in exchange for a limit on our forces. We have got to get busy with this because that's going to take a long time to work out. But arms control, not arms racing, is the only answer to this.
Well, happy holidays, everybody. I think, Joe, if you have a couple minutes to stick around, I'd love to ask you some of the less serious questions for our Patreon members.
Sure.
And I want to take you offline and ask you about cars and whiskey and different things. But I just want to maybe bring it back to center and say, I'm grateful for all that you do. You know, we talk in this show about staying vigilant. You're on the watch, and you've also been very kind and generous with me and many other leaders who've come up in the last couple of decades. You taught me. I've learned from you, both by the information, but also through your example. I mean, you're out there, keeping the heat on when so many folks are focused on other things. So it's a tremendous public service. I think it's an issue that all Americans should care about and does transcend politics. It might be one of those issues that we can actually unite around. But you've been an important leader and a conscience. You scare the shit out of people, but that's good because that reminds them of how serious and important these issues are. So I'm really grateful for your time and all of your insights. And I hope that you get a chance to have a Thanksgiving where if you talk about this, it's with people who want to talk about it and not, hey, pass the yams. Let's talk about ICBMs, right?
You were very kind, Paul. Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking with you. And yes, I'm going to Northern California for Thanksgiving. We'll spend the time with my daughter way up there in Eureka, California, very far away from all of this.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Joe. Happy Thanksgiving, happy holidays, and stay vigilant, my friend.
Thank you, Paul.
Archipelago, he tells me the left and right are dreams for those without a clue. And when you wake, it's time to grow. And it's not cool to believe in school, but if I can say one thing, I've seen the children of the revolution and the good trouble they can bring. He says the red and blue are dead and independent is an attitude. An island in the sea of rhetoric and archipelago, he tells me the left and right are dreams for those without a clue. And when you wait, it's time to grow.
Powered by Righteous Media.